Well, everyone who was ready to die for money, they have already run out for Putin. And that is why the Kremlin is currently making colossal efforts to drag someone else to the front by hook or by crook. And various methods are being used here. For instance, in Penza, they are testing mass roundups, effectively intimidating students in universities and technical colleges, or expelling more than usual so they can be sent off immediately, losing their deferment and being sent straight to fight. The conscription campaign now runs entirely year-round rather than twice a year at fixed times. So I'm not even talking about how many laws they've passed. There are additional inserts in military ID cards, end-to-end tracking of everyone who can be drafted, and so on and so forth. In other words, everything is completely set up so that if necessary, they can grab anyone on the street and drag them off to war.
Well, another interesting trend has started. In the first 6 months of 2026, courts in Russia handed down more than 1,000 sentences for terrorism-related charges. This is 58% more than in the same period of 2025. 1,234 people have been convicted. This is reported by the First Department Project. More than half of the defendants were convicted under the article on public calls for terrorism, its justification, or propaganda. This article is used by security forces to pressure journalists, publicists, activists, and bloggers for their public stance. At the same time, almost 2/3 of those convicted are classified in court registries. What does this indicate? It turns out that yes, the Kremlin is trying in this way to compensate for this lack of its mobilization resource and force these people to convict people and forcibly send them to the front.
Well, I don't think they will manage to send these people to the front simply because these are usually the very people who are categorically against the war. And actually today they are pinning terrorism charges on almost everyone. It is enough to simply speak out in support of what Ukraine is doing to become a terrorist. I'm not even talking about the fact that if you put a star on some Telegram channel that the Kremlin considers wrong today, well, say someone like Michael Naka, and I'm not even talking about the RDK or Freedom of Russia Legion Telegram channels. I'm not even talking about them. Just putting that paid star on a Telegram channel, that's it. That's already financing extremism. That's why today almost everyone is being labeled as terrorists and extremists. For example, a whole group of cultural figures, musicians and artists who attended the Slovonova festival in Montenegro hosted by Marat Gelman were declared terrorists and extremists by a commission's decision, and their accounts and real estate in Russia were blocked. So practically everyone here is a terrorist or an extremist.
Then it turns out that in Russia, they are starting to intensify this total terror among the population. I mean, where is the country heading? I mean, it's already clear that the media has been forgotten. Mobilization is happening. They're trying to train students with drones or pin a terrorism charge on someone. What's next? How much further can they push? How much more pressure can they apply? Does Putin really not understand that this is a very bad path he has chosen?
Well, he is trying to portray himself as some kind of Stalin remake. And actually, that's the direction he's moving in. And I will say that based on the sentences being handed out, Putin has already surpassed Stalin. The only thing is that they aren't executing people yet. The only thing, so to speak, that Putin doesn't have yet is that they haven't started executing people in droves. But otherwise, it's already quite headed in that direction. Another thing is that the elites also need to realize this, because the year 1937, back then, Stalin's actions were aimed against the elites as well. That is why, even now, members of the elite are already being slowly stripped of their assets and imprisoned. And there will be more. Therefore, one must understand that the longer Putin sits on his throne, the greater the number of people who will end up in prison, and indiscriminately at that, including quite wealthy millionaires, if not billionaires.
But it seems that Putin's fear is intensifying inside, well, his own head. Because the Russian dictator has started traveling by armored train. He is obviously panicking about his life, sending out fake motorcades to hide from Ukrainian drones. The New York Times writes about this, and observers note that Russian television has long been using so-called canned footage. These are pre-recorded clips with Putin that are presented as fresh news. Furthermore, false reports about the dictator's whereabouts are being used more and more frequently. In your opinion, if such trends are emerging, recalling again the Kremlin dictator's idol Stalin, what could this lead to? What does this indicate, and how dangerous and tense has the situation inside the Kremlin itself become?
It will lead to roughly the same thing that Stalin arrived at in 1953, when he died in a puddle of his own urine. That is roughly what all of this will lead to for Putin as well. And right now, yes, we see that fear is intensifying. By the way, for every dictator, as they get older, their fears really do intensify. And right now, since they have these pseudo-elections coming up and ratings are falling, Putin needs to appear before the citizens somehow and portray unity with the people. So he rushed off over there beyond the Urals to Siberia, to the Far East, to the Kuril Islands. He even made it all the way to Iturup Island. Well, because he thinks that Ukrainian drones won't reach that far.
Ukrainian drones, by the way, have shown themselves very well lately. So you saw how just overnight a fire broke out. Something happened to a strategic facility, Roscosmos, right? And there was another interesting enterprise nearby. How would you assess these long-range sanctions that Kyiv has been actively applying recently against the Russian Federation?
In Russia, they are saying that Ukrainian missiles actually hit Samara. So maybe after all, you and I have finally seen penguins singing flamenco, so anything is possible.
Yes, when we saw those images too, it was earlier today, it was an amazing sight. And of course, the main thing is that this is a blow to Putin's war machine. Because without this kind of production, without these microchips and everything that serves as components, these transitional stages so that his boys can eventually have something at the front, well, there's no other way to exert pressure. It turns out that people are even joking that the most effective sanctions are the ones that Ukraine is applying. Well, and the Kremlin, in fact, has finally made the choice in favor of continuing the war. Russia is ramping up the production of ballistic missiles to attack Ukraine's energy infrastructure during the autumn-winter season. According to the main Directorate of Intelligence, the Russian Federation is exceeding its production plans for Zircon, Onyx, Kak-101, and Caliber missiles. Also, the Russian Federation has received ballistic missiles from the DPRK and plans to deploy another contingent of North Korean military personnel. In parallel, Russia is preparing a new wave of mobilization, which, as we have already discussed, is planned for the period immediately after the elections conclude, when everyone will need to be sent to the front. Let's listen to the clip.
Right now, Putin believes that additional mobilization and the recruitment of military personnel from North Korea will allow him to drag out this war and intensify Russian assault activity. We are preparing for active operations. North
Korea? Who would have thought that North Korea would come to the aid of the Russian Federation, this so-called second army of the world, this whole invincible victory-obsessed army? North Korea? What do you think this fact screams about?
Well, that Putin has practically nothing left. Well, look, after all, Ukrainian sanctions have led to the start of a second wave of a gasoline crisis. And today there are already gasoline shortages in Moscow as well. And if there are gasoline shortages in Moscow, imagine what is happening in the rest of the country. Therefore, yes, as we always know, when the Kremlin fails at everything, it starts striking Ukrainian cities and civilians with double the force. Well, and since they are, of course, making their own missiles, but you see North Korea's missiles are needed. So bit by bit from around the world, Putin gets his missiles. He's gathering them from everywhere. He can't manage to gather gasoline, but he can manage to gather missiles. And actually, we still need to pay attention to, I didn't mention it by accident, it's a very important story, Putin's trip to the Kuril Islands, because it's an indicator to the United States that Putin is still playing for Team China. And for the internal anti-Chinese party, it's an indicator that Putin has set a course for complete, total involvement in everything Chinese and complete subordination to China. And this should already make everyone nervous and actually lead, among other things, finally to Ukraine receiving more missiles, and Patriots and maybe Tomahawks will finally appear.
Yes, that would be, by the way, very nice. We were discussing on air today how the NATO military-industrial complex is expanding with new Rheinmetall factories being built not far from Ukraine. This is a very good sign because logistics are being shortened, and it will be possible to more quickly replenish those supplies, which unfortunately are being used up very quickly at the front, and winter is coming. By the way, did you appreciate this rude stunt by the Ministry of Death of the Russian Federation when they refused the proposal to freeze the front with this post of theirs like a bolt from the blue and something along those lines? Rudeness.
Well, again, nothing new. Yes, we know perfectly well that as long as Putin sits on the throne, Russia does not want to stop the war. And whatever they might say, in reality, the main opponent of peace today is Putin and his entire camarilla. So yes, of course. And the ministry, which for some reason is called the Ministry of Defense, although in reality it is the Ministry of Aggression, and the ministry, which is also strangely called the Ministry of Foreign Affairs, although in reality it is the Ministry of Propaganda, this entire Kremlin machine is aimed at shouting in every possible way that they will fight to the end until, in fact, Ukraine disappears from the face of the earth. Putin does not hide his goals, and his main goal is to destroy Ukraine as an independent state.
Yes, for him,